A journey of enlightenment on the path of spirituality. You'll never get lost with Radio Islam International leading the way.
You are tuned into Radio Islam International, and we speak digital settler colonialism this evening with Omar Zahzah. He's a writer, poet, organizer, and assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities. And yes, for us, studies at the San Francisco State University. And he will also speak to us about his book a bit later on in this interview, Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. Omar, thank you so much for speaking to us, and welcome to Radio Islam.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So many people are, quite familiar about this phenomenon, and I think it predates very much the genocide, but it has only been intensified in the genocide because, I've looked up just cursorily certain reports that already from the time of 2021 it was a defined phenomenon, during the Sheikh Jarrah raids and the attacks on Masjid al-Aqsa, etc., how posts were being taken down by the social media giants. But recently, especially post the or let's say during the period of the genocide, community standards used, weaponized against Palestinian posts, so many accounts taken down, so many videos taken down, so many accounts shadow banned. And now post the genocide, there appears to be a witch hunt in this regard, with Meta, for example, as you've wrote about recently, deleting Saleh al-Jafarawi's Instagram account, taking down tons of valuable content that could be used as evidence against the Israeli entity, and thereafter the attempts to buy up TikTok in the United States of America. So these are all the kind of phenomenon that we discussed this evening, and it's been very much at the center of your research. If you could perhaps take us from a high level down, we could focus on the specific instances that are involved here and the specific players, and how there are Israelis from the military who have served on these boards and in these companies, etc. But you've put it under a bigger umbrella in what you've called and what we've marketed this interview as this evening, digital settler colonialism. Explain to us why you feel that kind of framing is so important.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you're absolutely right to point out that a lot of this predates the most recent genocide that we've seen under the Zionist project, the Israeli state. I'll start by answering the very final part of the question right away, and then I think kind of zoom out from there. But I use the term digital settler colonialism. And as I note in the book, I'm not the first person to use it, but I apply it so that we can think about how big tech, and in the text I am primarily, but by no means exclusively, focused on social media, so digital media platforms. And again, the question being, how does big tech, including through these platforms, reinforce through the digital sphere the physical process of settler colonialism, erasure, and expulsion that the Zionist settler colonial project needs to continue to apply in order to realize its ultimate mandate of the complete seizure of land, elimination of the indigenous Palestinian people, and of course the broader regional dominance that the colonial Zionist project inherently entails. So again, the question became, how do these digital spaces reinforce these physical processes of colonization, of military occupation, apartheid? And I started looking at this prior to October 7th, 2023, the aftermath, which was the latest genocide, because I had already started to see, from the experiences of Palestinians themselves, how we were having this crucial paradox unfold in real time. And this was how the very instruments that had, however inadvertently, allowed for counter-hegemonic narratives about Palestine to be created on spaces that, had branded themselves to be the alternative to the quote unquote mainstream, right? A lot of the branding of the social media platforms and companies had been, we allow for the creation of truly democratic spaces. We allow for previously suppressed narratives, to be able to find expression. We provide the platforms, the businesses that allow for this to take place, right? And so in 2021, when you have the uprisings of Palestinians protesting their looming expulsion from the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, you start to see them using social media to very pointed effect, right? And to such an extent that it does start to shift the broader conversations around Palestine, even under the auspices of hegemonic media outlets, right? So you start to see these legacy corporate media outlets like CNN increasingly platform Palestinians to talk about not just the expulsion that they're facing in terms of being expelled from their homes, but also about important reframings of the Palestinian struggle. So you start to have, more so than I think at any contemporary moment in history, a really sustained broader reckoning with the Palestinian struggle that had been initiated by Palestinians themselves, that had been initiated by their resistance. And so as a result of this, social media companies start to take note. And, again, to come back to this paradox, the very spaces and platforms that had lended themselves to actually being a counter-hegemonic instrument, right, all of a sudden start to attempt to recreate the types of erasure and censorship, we should say, that we had previously been more familiar with seeing from corporate legacy media outlets, right? And so I use the term digital settler colonialism as a way of focusing on how all of these things, right? You might look at something like social media censorship or censorship of, a post for Palestine, or the deletion or even banning of pro-Palestine content creators from hegemonic platforms like the meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, or on X. You might look at this and say, this is distinct from, say, the applications of AI for targeted assassination. And on a literal level, there is, of course, a distinction. But the broader reality is that all of these different, seemingly disparate acts of suppression and oppression are digital reinforcements of the physical processes of colonization that Zionism mandates, right? So all of these discrete, different forms of digital oppression are ultimately reinforcing a broader settler colonial project, which is why I insist on the term digital settler colonialism. And in fact, I updated this term from my previous usage of digital apartheid, right around 2021. That was initially the term that I used to talk about these social media instances of censorship on such a massive scale of posts about Palestine. But I realized that all of this is feeding back into a broader settler colonial project. And so I felt it was important to use an umbrella term that really forced us to confront with how each aspect of tech repression that we're dealing is ultimately fortifying a broader settler colonial project. And the way that I distinguish some of my analysis from others who had used the term digital settler colonialism prior is that I also really insist on contending with how what we're dealing with is not just a colonial application of digital technologies, but that we are looking at a very active partnership between big tech, the big tech industry, predominantly from the US, as well as the Zionist settler colonial project, the Israeli state, right? There's nothing that makes it inevitable that big tech platforms would inherently reinforce Israeli mandates for censorship or for suppression. Well, the reason that they do so is they're an ultimate pursuance of their bottom line, and the configuration of US geo-imperial convention is such that the businesses that want to realize the greatest success, under capitalism, right, inevitably skew towards reinforcing the hegemonic common sense that is fortifying imperialism, fortifying the broader projects of violence that best service U.S. foreign policy, right, under geo-imperialist construct of political affairs. And so, what I want to keep reminding the reader, within my book and within my other output, following that, because of course this remains a very pronounced issue, is that all of these different forms, again, of digital oppression and censorship we're seeing are reinforcing a broader settler colonial project, which is why I insist on the term digital settler colonialism. And lastly, I think to come to another point that you had raised, which I think is very important, this question of Meta's deletion of the account of the assassinated Palestinian journalist Saleh al-Jafrawi, right, is we've now seen digital settler colonialism pass through several phases, right? The first, of course, is, when we saw what happened with the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings and the subsequent Unity Intifada. Basically, the at the time novel, but what has become a normalization of censorship on these platforms. We've seen it. We've seen this normalization applied through this latest genocide, right, in Gaza. And now, as you importantly point out too, we're at a moment where we're seeing the intense political urgency of this dynamic as a result of the aftermath of genocide, in the extent that we have all of this documented digital archival evidence that Palestinian journalists, heroically put themselves on the line to document, right, to create some evidence for the rest of the world to see and to take action. And now we're seeing companies like Meta actively deleting these archives of evidence, right? There was this old adage that the internet is forever. We're seeing actually one of the dangers is that this may not be the case, and it's especially not the case if you're a Palestinian resisting and documenting genocide. And so, again, it's just to bring it back, we're seeing the reinforcement of settler colonialism through digital means on a massive scale, and it's important to document it and to continue to resist it and to raise as much attention about it as possible, and not fall into the trap of thinking, as I think a lot of these companies are wont to have us do, that maybe it's not so bad. Maybe these reports about censorship are exaggerated. Maybe these platforms are actually fine and they just make mistakes. We need to resist their propaganda and understand that all of these seemingly discrete acts of repression are servicing a broader settler colonial project of elimination, expulsion, and genocide.
Which brings me, Omar, thank you so much for that response. It brings me to this question relating to, should we be surprised? And when we experience this kind of frustration of posts being taken down, of accounts being scrubbed, people could argue that were we naive in the first place to have expected better? I mean, we have these long lists of terms and conditions that nobody reads and everybody just signs up to. And aren't we effectively, by choosing to be, as many people have said, part of these platforms, we are effectively consumers, allowing our personal lives to be sold for profit, our data to be up on offer for the biggest bidder. So when the behavior turns out in this particular way, should we be surprised? I'm not saying let's promote fatalism, but shouldn't we then take some responsibility ourselves for being part of these platforms on their terms?
Well, that's certainly what the platforms would have us believe, right? We have these community standards, we have these terms and conditions. You need to agree if you're going to use our ostensibly free service. Of course, we know none of them are really free because, we're having our behavior tracked, our data mined, right? And we're being surveilled in all of these ways, of different levels of severity, often with the goal of at least, servicing up, kind of algorithmically curated, targeted advertisements, if not something a little bit more severe, which is becoming an increasing issue when you see the, for example, one of the things that we're looking at in the US is also the collaboration between law enforcement agencies, including immigration and customs enforcement agencies and these tech platforms, right? But so again, these companies do have this very individualized approach. They do say, we shouldn't be too surprised, and in fact, we shouldn't have any recourse to push back when they end up doing things that work against our ability to express ourselves or to advocate, for freedom or for liberation, or to speak out against political injustice in general, if they think, right, that they shouldn't have to tolerate it because they're their platforms. Now, I think the question of should we be surprised, it's a little bit of yes and no. I would say that, again, under capitalism, under imperialism, I don't think we should necessarily be surprised politically when we see companies acting in ultimate self-interest, even when that means collaborating with some of the most repressive political projects in modern history, or continuing to whitewash genocide or military occupation or apartheid. In a political sense, you could even argue that it's almost natural because, having your bottom line be the ultimate dictate of what determines the success of a company is often going to put you in direct confrontation with, the different conditions that make for supporting people's, collective rights, supporting projects of, civil and social betterment, right? As cliche as it sounds, often to say this, making the world a better place probably is not in line with good business sense, especially if you're under such an extreme form of imperialism and capitalism as we find ourselves, particularly in the US and the West more broadly, right? But I also don't think I do think we should be surprised, and I actually think we need to be channeling that surprise into meaningful advocacy for change, precisely because we need to push back against a dominant order that would normalize the private status of companies, meaning that they're actually able to do anything and everything that they see fit to best meet their business interests, and claim that we can't hold them accountable, right? So I guess in the short term, we shouldn't be surprised that they're doing it, but I would argue that we need to continue to remain surprised and not let ourselves become kind of jaded and say, this is the way things need to be, and sort of give into it. In fact, we need to continue to push back and think of new ways to hold these corporations and the representatives accountable for their actions. So one of the things one example that I often think back to when I'm making this point is, Francesca Albanese's report on the big tech industry and its fortification of Israeli settler colonialism and genocide, right? In that report, and I believe this was June of 2025 when it was issued, but it makes the case that we need to start thinking of ways internationally to hold representatives of companies that directly profit from colonization and genocide, as is the case with Palestine, directly accountable, right? How do we start to think about what legal action against the representatives of these companies, against these companies themselves? What does that look like? How do we begin to actually meaningfully translate that into action, as the international community? I think those are the types of tracks along which we need to seriously start thinking, because we've seen the dangers of what these we've seen the dangers basically of what the assumption of this total impunity that comes from being able to continuously defer to the status of being a private company yields, right? And so again, maybe we wouldn't be surprised politically, but I think we need to actually continue to cultivate that knee-jerk response of surprise and let it help us translate it into meaningful action to push back against the world order, whereby the death and dispossession, of an entire group of people can be good business sense, as can be the censorship of people who speak out against those practices.
I'm interested in this paradox because when people would, Omar, talk about the shifts that have occurred around the world and what has contributed, what has been an important contributing factor to the growing isolation of Israel around the world and the success or the resonance of the Palestinian cause around the world, people would speak about the influence of social media and opening up people's minds and opening up the discussion and the live streamed images, as painful as they have been, coming out of Gaza. So this is always cited as a factor for the success, the growing success of the Palestinian narrative. But our very discussion this evening talks about the very same platforms as a tool of colonial suppression. How do we make sense of this kind of paradox? Immense benefits that have been derived from it, but at the same time, the very same platforms morphing into an instrument, direct instrument of control, extension of the physical subjugation on the ground.
Absolutely. I mean, that exact paradox is what really led me to begin writing about these questions in the first place. And what I think it does is, I think it's a very important example of how media in general, and I'm not just talking about social media in this moment, but let's say media more broadly, right? Even if you're thinking about legacy media, you know, like many other cultural instruments, I think media has so much inherent capacity to benefit the social well-being more broadly. And then you have the ways that media is kind of confined when we start to have this setup whereby the ultimate purpose is not so much to prioritize the well-being or the expanded consciousness that these tools can bring about, but you know, thinking of these tools in terms of, you know, how do they actually better enable a company to make, you know, an astronomical profit, or how do they better enable a particular regime, you know, say the, you know, US imperialist order more broadly, kind of rein in its social and political control, not just locally but at the international scale. When you start to have, you know, these types of questions be the calculus for how your media operates in the world, I think you inevitably are going to come back to a manipulation of media that is not really founded on the principles that many individual journalists would claim to adhere to, right? You know, we're speaking truth to power, we're making sure the public is informed, we're raising political consciousness so that, you know, people can take meaningful action and be agents of change. All of those things go out the window when you start to look at a context in which media becomes simply another arm of a ruling or a dominant regime, of a hegemonic social order. So I think the paradox that we see, where this very instrument, you know, is blamed, and I think rightfully blamed, for being one of the chief culprits in the downfall, right, the absolute plummeting, you know, of the image of the Israeli state, is also, you know, one of the same mechanisms that that state, you know, leverages so intensely in order to censor and surveil and suppress on its part. Part of that is, you know, we have the ability to create and maintain and defend social orders where tools of media can really service domination rather than being tied inherently to the collective good, to the public good, you know, rather than entrenching the interests of power of a very elite few. So that's, for me, that's one of the chief ways we make sense of it. And when we think of it along those lines, I think social media is maybe one of the most extreme and perhaps effective examples of this question, because I'm hard pressed to think of another example where you have such a stark demonstration of all of the things that media is capable of doing and all of the things that the powers that be try to kind of funnel it into doing instead, right? And, you know, doing that somewhat ineffectively because, you know, after all this, as you're saying, we still have this paradox whereby everybody can point to their phones and say, you know, this is the reason that the image of the Israeli state is plummeting, and most likely irreversibly, right? So instead of being confused by that paradox, though, and, you know, I say this as much for myself as for everybody else, because I also see myself as somebody who's continuing to learn about these things in real time, even as I'm interested in writing about it and researching them, is, you know, we need to probably just continue to sharpen that contradiction, right? So that the attempt to kind of pivot or to reverse course becomes, you know, continues to be unsustainable, right? I think so long as we live under capitalism, so long as we live under imperialism, something that has a real potential to genuinely affect collective well-being being manipulated towards the sharpest interests of, you know, a political or an economic elite is going to keep happening. But, you know, part of what we can do as people who are interested in resistance and in liberation is to continue sharpening that contradiction, to make it clear that there's so much more that these things could be doing, and to continue to use them for that purposes. And actually, that's one of the takeaways of my book, is that Palestinians have always been, you know, very savvy manipulators of media, making media do all of the things it was never supposed to do, to talk about causes it was never supposed to talk about, you know, in this case, the Palestinian struggle.
Let's just look at the fight back, or as I called it, the witch hunt, which really seems to be a very distinct or very clear motif that's emerging post the ceasefire, where there's just such a thrust to be able to target Palestinian content. With everything that has been gained for the Palestinian narrative over the past 2 years, amidst obviously the great pain and destruction and death and crimes in Gaza, do you feel there is genuine reason to be worried about the impact of this pushback in the long run on the Palestinian narrative or on documentation, available documentation of the genocide and the Palestinian cause?
Yes, I absolutely do think we need to be worried about pushback, and that includes, and because it's such an important example, I'll reiterate it again. But what we were just discussing a few minutes ago with things like the deletion of the Instagram accounts of, assassinated journalists like Saleh al-Jafarawi, or frankly anybody who has documented the genocide in Gaza, as well as the continuously increasing repression in the West Bank, or just the general broader, Zionist crackdown on Palestinians. We should be concerned that these companies are going to be honing their mechanisms and, making sure just to rein in the impunity with which they assume the ability to unilaterally delete accounts or to erase or disappear content from their platforms. We should expect them to do that again, because as we were discussing, part of the purpose of all of this documentation is that eventually, or it's going to lend itself to being a digital archive of evidence of genocide, of colonialism, of military occupation, all of these different things. So in addition to censoring individual users, I think what we're seeing now is that these companies are working to refine the next strategy of making sure that this content gets irreversibly disappeared. So we should, I think, remain vigilant about that, and trying to raise the alarms as much as possible. And of course, the targeting of users, I think, is an issue. It remains an issue. It's always been an issue, to the extent that Zionism has always relied on this strategy of demonizing, advocates for Palestine, right? Of being, anti-Semites, or being quote unquote terrorist supporters, all of these different things. But the danger that we see with the digital settler colonialism as we're experiencing it now is a lot of those attitudes are often baked into the very community standards that these companies are practicing, right? So what I think we could expect to see and remain on the lookout for is an ongoing escalation, not only by individuals aligned with the Israeli state or acting on behalf of the Zionist project, but also the companies themselves, who have often internalized these beliefs and these practices as part of their kind of stated explicit rules of propriety on their platforms. And of course, a lot of that has to do with how deeply entrenched the Israeli state is in U.S. big tech, from the numerous veterans of 8200 that make up the workforce of different big tech companies, as well as the presence on the board or in other leading positions of companies like Meta, various individuals who have also helped the Israeli state refine its surveillance and censorship apparatus, including its increasing criminalization of Palestinian social media posts, then end up working for U.S. big tech companies all the more. So all these dynamics we really need to remain vigilant about and worry about them kind of translating into I think basically just going off the rails even more, right? We've already seen it happening. It continues to happen. So I definitely think now that we've seen the image of the Israeli state in such shambles as it is, and we're seeing such growing and continuously growing indignation at the Israeli project, we should expect to encounter these things all the more. But at the same time, we need to continue to push back against them and to raise the alarms about them as much as possible.
Something else that I think about in terms of when this content is disappeared from the internet is obviously the growing role that AI models play in our lives, and the fact that the answers that feed into those models all obviously come from the available information on social media, and obviously with a big bulk of that information removed from social media, it would obviously lead to very warped answers that are then fed into AI models and perhaps the research community and the academia and so forth. So that's just another thought that comes to my mind on that point. We've really just touched the surface of this discussion. I just want to ask you two final questions briefly, Omar. And the first one being, amidst the frustration that so many people feel with the removal of this content, and these are essentially people on the outside speaking about Palestine, one can imagine the greater level of frustration when it's a matter of life and death for people within Palestine. And if essentially you speak to bots, essentially you are speaking to faceless representatives of this policy. You don't really seem to have any recourse when such dramatic actions are taken against your account. One response to this has been, let's create our own platforms. Let's migrate to platforms that seem to be more ethical. How do you view such calls?
That's such an important question, and it's an issue that even different organizers that I've interviewed in the book have had differing perspectives on. My sense, I know we're a little bit short on time, but my sense is that it's a little bit of a combination. I do think that it's crucial to try to think about developing new platforms. And in fact, I know that there's a new social media platform called Upscrolled. You or your listeners may be familiar with it. It was developed, I believe, by a Palestinian Australian individual. And it's basically a social media platform that does not apply any of the anti-Palestinian content moderation that we're more familiar to seeing with the meta platforms like Instagram. And I know that one is growing, so I definitely think it's a good sign if the movement has social media platforms that are more geared toward what it is trying to advance and that evade censorship. So I do think that it's important to develop new ones, but I also do find myself agreeing with a lot of the points that organizers raise about meeting people where they are. So to that end, many individuals are still unfortunately going to be, or at least start out on the more hegemonic platforms like Instagram or like Facebook, or even YouTube, right, which is encountering a lot of its own issues. So to me, the ultimate approach implies basically some kind of a combination. I don't think that we should completely abandon the larger platforms. I don't think people should be ceding ground. I think it's important to continue to push back and try to affect change in terms of raising people's consciousness, even as the platforms themselves become increasingly censorious and increasingly unapologetically aligned with the Zionist project. But at the same time, I do think it is important to continue to develop new platforms like Upscrolled, and in general to think about how do we redefine the idea of what a platform is, the idea of tech that genuinely advances justice and collective liberation, that is not geared towards the kind of inhumane calculus that we see US big tech using, right, which would inevitably drives these companies to want to maximize their profits and their social and political capture all the more. So I would say I think it's a combination. We shouldn't necessarily cede the digital ground completely, but as we remain on it and as we continue to fight the good fight on the hegemonic platforms, we should continue to think about what developing newer platforms and migrating to newer ones like Upscrolled might look like.
Last one for you. I guess everything that we've spoken about in this brief discussion speaks to ideas that are profusely elaborated on in your book. Your new book called Terms of Servitude has been described as a groundbreaking book documenting how US tech companies support Israeli settler colonialism and genocide. Just a small shout out to the book. Why is it so important to engage with this book, and anything that you can tell us about its availability?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that very generous question. I wrote the book because I felt that there was still a gaping lack of broader, sustained engagement with how big tech fortifies collective oppression when it comes to the question of Palestine. And so when I began thinking about a larger project that kind of developed the articles I was beginning to write in 2021, I was already working at a moment in time where you started to have book-length studies about the different ways in which the big tech industry fortifies racism or misogyny, patriarchy, white supremacy, right? All of these different systems and structures of oppression. And yet, although we were at a moment in time, and again, this is 2021 going into 2022, not even at the latest genocide yet, there was a surprising lack of engagement with Palestine, again, from these broader kind of more generalized studies and their platforms. And so it occurred to me that in the same way that we have, very important studies about how big tech is fortifying different forms of racism, is fortifying the class hierarchies that are, really baked into U.S. society. We need to start thinking about a study that would put these questions of how tech fortifies issues of structural oppression for the Palestinian context along the same terms. And, so for me, Terms of Servitude was really the attempt to deliver that broader, sustained project. Of course, it's inspired by and first and foremost dedicated to the movement for a liberated Palestine, right? The activists and organizers, that make up this movement. But it is also supposed to be a broader reckoning with how we cannot have a Palestine exception when we talk about big tech oppression. And in fact, the ways that big tech oppresses Palestinians is fundamental. Understanding that is fundamental to understanding the inherently repressive machinations of big tech as an industry in general, right? And so, in the book, even as I'm part of what I do, and again, like I'm drawing on studies that I think are very valuable, but I found myself in certain moments, questioning things like, well, why do certain critics talk about how inherently repressive Russia is, right, when they're talking about tech repression, but nobody will even touch Palestine when you have such a documented trove of evidence from human rights organizations, from digital rights organizations, of how the Israeli state is in many ways a keen innovator in criminalizing digital media expression, right? And completely suspending any semblance of collective or democratic rights and collaborating, with these companies in order to better enable it to do all of these things, right? This is something that not only needs to be more widely engaged from a critical collective, right, but it's something that needs to be actively decried, right, by the world. And so I feel that, Terms of Servitude is my attempt to deliver the book that I felt was missing from a broader general conversation about the dangerous moves that big tech is making. And so I would say that, that is ultimately its significance, as well as the fact that I've really tried, to the best of my ability to not compromise on the necessity of Palestinian liberation, not compromise on the identification of Zionism as a settler colonial project, and not compromising finally on the inherent necessity of Palestinian liberation from the river to the sea as a critic. So those are some of the reasons that I think that, to me, this felt like an important book to attempt. And as far as whether or not it resonates in such a way, that's ultimately up to the readers to decide. But as far as availability, Seven Stories Press, the co-publishing press is in charge of distribution, so they should be able to answer any questions about availability, in your immediate locale. But of course, I'm always happy to do talks, or interviews like this, or to coordinate with people to do different events to talk about the book and talk about some of the ideas of it. So I thank you for this platform, and I thank you for your time.
Absolutely. I thank you for the very detailed discussion and a very important area that I think is just going to be evolving and requiring additional activism and commentary on it. It's such a larger than life place within all of our lives. Omar Zahzah is a writer, poet, organizer, and assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies at the San Francisco State University. And he is the author, as we just mentioned, of Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle, which has just been published. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and all the best for the great work, Omar.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And with that, we take a short break.